Grant God thy protection, and in protection reason, and in reason light, and in light truth, and in truth justice, and in justice love, and in love the love of God, and in the love of God, Gunfed, God and all goodness. Amen.
Amen.
Did I pronounce that right?
Good
Gunfed?
enough.
Probably not. I'm not a.
Welsh.
I had to make a very serious decision in the 90s when I started studying Yeats's Celtic Mysteries, and the decision was I realized to go the Gaelic route or the Brythonic, right into the Welsh language and Welsh Druidry with the corollaries of Breton, Manx, or the Gaelic. And since my family was from Scotland and Ireland, it was an easy decision. And of course, with John Michael Greer, then over the next following years, veering heavier into the Welsh, I was like, well, it's meant to be, because all the things I had hoped John Michael Greer would do in Gaelic Druidry and the Irish language, he didn't do, and no one's done it still.
Mm,
I need more years to live, or a few more lives, I think.
that's where you come in.
Well,
You
welcome,
fill the
Dr.
gap in the accent literature.
Absolutely. I'm working hard on all of it.
Therein is the invitation. You see, you just spoke in many ways an invitation that would summon you toward that kind of work, a kind of calling through our own kind of interaction here.
We're going to have a wonderful exploration of the psyche and the space between us, and see what happens in that ternary
Let's do it.
point of balance and
Let's
focal
explore
equilibrium.
betweenness.
Absolutely.
Austin Osman Spare, betweenness. The
Somehow, but
neither.
somehow between us, we'll find some sort of becoming in this podcast.
Oh, I know we will.
We're in the unbeing state, and then we'll finish it and be in the being state. Okay, Dr. Ian Edward, welcome to Magic Without Fears, the Hermetic podcast. A fun and curious beginning to this episode, which has been far too long coming, but deserving of the time, I think, that I realized the further I went into Howe, the further I needed time to spend with him and give myself, sort of over the course of the last year, my self-directed kind of seminar, which fortunately in grad school is a real thing. People maybe actually should know that, is like you can go to professors and put together a course with them. It's not that uncommon, and it's not a bad skill set to be able to have for your own future education, especially if you end up being outside of the academic system like so many of us do. But you are over at Duquesne University today, and I was wanting to start off actually a bit, and maybe just know a bit more about your actual job and work there, because it must be interesting to not only keep you on, but to engage someone with a mind as interesting and fascinating as yours.
Yeah, so I can talk a little bit about my work at Duquesne, but I think it would be important also to mention that I got my PhD in clinical psychology from Duquesne University as well in 2006. And for many that might not know about Duquesne University's psychology and philosophy programs in particular, but they're very well steeped in existential phenomenology, post-structuralism, postmodernism, and depth psychology in general. So it's one of the, I would say, relatively few universities internationally with a real emphasis on existential phenomenology, depth psychology, and post-structuralist approaches to doing psychotherapy, which is what originally drew me to Duquesne as a student. I was fortunate enough to also become hired by Duquesne University. And so now I serve as the Assistant Vice President for Student Wellbeing, which means I manage counseling services and also recreation services. I'm responsible for developing the university's model of care, which is what I would call a holistic model for the 21st century student, and in many ways is based on E. Graham Howe's work, which was the basis for my doctoral dissertation, incidentally. So what people have in their hands right now, in terms of my work on Howe, right there you go, a Druid and Psychologist clothing, was based on my doctoral dissertation, which was completed in 2006. And the original title was Truth as Relationship. And that title I took in large measure based on Krishnamurti's influence on Howe. And so that title really speaks to that relationship and also a key element of Howe's thought. I'm also an adjunct professor here at Duquesne, which means that I teach out of the psychology and philosophy departments. I'm proud to say that I'm one of the, I don't know, I might be the only psychologist at Duquesne to have taught in the philosophy department. And so I taught a philosophical ethics course, which I based on ancient Greco-Roman philosophy, looking at well-being from the perspective of the ancient Greeks and Romans, talking about different forms of self-care and self-mastery, focusing a lot on Stoicism. So that's also an interest of mine as well, like practical ancient Greek and Roman thought. So I do a lot of different things here at Duquesne, including serving on committees and just being the point person for any time there is a mental health emergency, which for many of you who may know, in colleges and universities, there's a mental health epidemic, even a mental health pandemic. And so college counselors, psychologists are quite busy nowadays dealing with students who are presenting with psychological issues.
Yeah, it is scary what's going on these days. We saw it coming. I remember me and my friends, we joked a lot in the 90s about how many kids were suddenly all of a sudden on antidepressants, and we would joke about what it would be like in 20, 30 years, and it's not what we thought it would be, but it's in many ways so much worse, but also so much better. Let's not forget how lucky we all are to have
Absolutely.
these
I think it's important to
opportunities
say
that
that.
we have. And my sister works in psychology. She works at a
Oh, good.
government funded center with mainly women. And that right there, just as soon as I say that, you can imagine what the problems are, of course, at the center. It's everyone wants to be included into it, but not everyone there is actually going to treat the other women well. And she is on the front lines of that and just starting her master's in psychology as well through a
Great.
Salzburg program,
Beautiful.
heavily influenced by phenomenology and existentialism, which made me very
Excellent.
happy, as you're aware, because you've glanced at my academic work a bit. So yeah, it's not common to have these programs, but they are around and they are out there to be able to nourish and provide fertile grounds for people like yourself who are not just interdisciplinary, but downright extraterritorial in the pursuit of not simply exoteric subjects.
Absolutely. And I always like to say too, and this is comparable to what Jung would say often, because he had a background that was quite rich, where he had engaged in a lot of research on a multiplicity of subjects and wove them all together in, I think, a very creative fashion. But he always maintained that throughout all of this, he was a doctor of the soul. He was a healer. He wasn't a philosopher per se. He wasn't an alchemist per se, even though he used those disciplines quite liberally. But he was really interested in understanding the nature of the human psyche, and in particular, charting paths toward healing. And so for me, that's also an emphasis. While I might have a lot of different interests and weave a lot of different ideas in my own work, I see myself primarily as a healer of the soul.
Yeah, of course that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's even a surprising number of practitioners that you might not think see themselves that way do in fact. Like you go back to say like the Fama Fraternitatis, one of the guidelines it gives Rosicrucians is to heal gratis. Right? They are healers first and foremost. Profess nothing other than to heal, and that gratis. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, healing is it's almost like it's so pervasive within a lot of spiritual traditions and practices, it almost goes unmentioned and unfocused on sometimes, which I think is interesting, given that it's the main end goal. I mean, whether you see it as henosis or just individuation and actualization.
Right. No, I think that's a really good point, because in many ways, what we're talking about is a return to something that's implicit, and it's not something that's necessarily made explicit. And I think sometimes it has a lot to do with the personality of the practitioner as well. and how they engage with esoteric practices or contemplative practices, and how their personality, their attachment style kind of manifests the way in which they take up those practices and the needs that get served through them. And so I'm very much in line with this ancient Greco-Roman idea that in order to guide or to lead others, one has to work on oneself, and that it's not a one and done sort of deal, but it's an ongoing process. They would call it self-mastery or self-care, but that's an important emphasis for me as a healer and for those that I supervise. And it's been a long-standing tradition in psychoanalysis and depth psychology that the most important part of being a clinician is one's own work, one's work on oneself. And that's an ongoing process.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a few things to cover today. Primarily, we're going to focus on Eric Graham
Sure.
Howe, and I want to dive into that. But it would be fun to talk about a bit of the other work you do as well first, before we dive fully into Howe, because I have some wonderful questions and
For
curiosity to
sure.
explore with that. And maybe the first one to start off with that would be good is perhaps Austin Osman Spare, since that's the second greatest interest, I suppose, I have in your works. Though now that I'm more familiar with your works, I'm quite certain I'll even read the analysis of the Book of the Law someday. And analysis is probably the wrong word, but I'm not very thelemic at all. It just wasn't my cup of tea, though I have a great love of it as a magical religion, and it's fascinating in so many ways. If it was my cup of tea, I'd be very happy about that. You can't choose these things really necessarily, right? Whereas I
Right.
wish I had discovered Eric Graham Howe as a kid. Like honestly, I had to write. This is a collection of his writings because they're all out of print. He's
All out of print.
suspiciously absent from the internet. Even there's not even a Wikipedia page, if I recall, on him.
Right.
And
Yeah. And that is, oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, that's fine. It's finding as I'm a little bit upset that I didn't get to discover him as a kid. If I showed you my 13-year-old Druid diary, you look at it, and you know what? The main slogans that were given to me by the spirit at 13 were are literally almost identical verbatim to what Howe said in the end of your book is the only thing he was told directly
Mhm.
about finding your
Absolutely.
path and following it. And I was
Yep.
like, how did I not know this man? How has he been hidden from us? How?
How is a good question. And I think for me, when I embarked upon the dissertation phase, that was one of the questions that I attempted to answer. So when I was introduced to Eric Graham Howe in graduate school, I hadn't heard of him. I had no knowledge of him. I was interested in doing my dissertation on either Alan Watts or R.D. Laing or a psychobiography of Aleister Crowley. These were all interests of mine. Interested in the work of Israel Regardie, because in many ways he has his own background as a neo-Reichian analyst, and I found that quite compelling as a depth psychologist myself. So I wanted to do this psychobiography on Aleister Crowley, and as you can imagine, that was met with some resistance. Couldn't find a chair. Found one reader who was interested in it, who happens to be a mentor, teacher, and former supervisor of mine, Stanton Marlin, author of a book called The Black Sun, The Alchemy, an Art of Darkness, is a well worthwhile read for anyone who's interested in depth psychotherapy, archetypal psychology, and the notion of the black sun.
And he was your supervisor?
He was my clinical supervisor.
So both of our supervisors wrote books called The Black Sun.
Oh, who's
Because
yours?
mine was Nicholas Goodrick Clark before he died.
Okay.
I didn't finish my PhD because of first the recession, and then when we recovered from that, he passed, and it was a nightmare. But that's another story. But he also wrote one of his texts on the Black Sun and the influence of course, um, occult thought on Nazism and stuff like
For
that.
sure. And it's an
Really heavy.
important part of the way, just to briefly dialogue about that, it's an important part of the way in which I understand working with people who might be profoundly depressed or profoundly melancholic or have experienced a trauma of some kind, which is, how does the dark place that they might be in have its own illumination? Not that it's transmuted into light, right? Not that there's this alchemical move where you transmute or translate or transform the light into darkness, but how does the darkness itself radiate its own light? And so if we think about Eric Graham Howe's work on that very subject, right? It's this idea that one kind of pays very close attention to the experience of depression because he saw it as ultimately a phase that moves one toward wholeness or healing. So one has to pay close attention in a meditative sort of way, a contemplative sort of way, in terms of what sort of message, what sort of healing agent is coming from the depression itself. And for me, that was such a radical concept because it doesn't involve curing the depression. It doesn't involve eliminating it through strategies or psychotropic medication, but listening to it, paying close attention to what it might be saying to the soul.
We're just going to keep going with the flow. We'll do spare later. Depression is fascinating in his take on it, and I knew that instantly because when I was reading it, I mentioned one thing about his take on depression to my sister, which was that Howe said the only job of the therapist is to keep the depressed patient alive. That's his only job, and she actually stopped. She's a Libra, so she often, just keeps going on her day and like a good air sign takes the information in and then moves off while looking grand in the process. But she stopped, paused, looked over me and said, "Really?" So you could see that information jarred with what she's learned probably however they're teaching undergraduate psychology and stuff in at UBC today. So um she was very keen to learn more about how as well, and just from one line which speaks to his potency and his view on depression is very interesting, but it resonates a bit with my own experience, which I've only really ever had circumstantial depression, except for when I was a little kid and I was filled with despair after a parent's divorce. But then I had to find my path and follow it, and then I was fine.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that might be one of the more compelling parts of his work, kind of looking at his understanding of depression and how that might differentiate, let's say, from orthodox Freudian psychoanalysis. And so, he talks about, just to speak a little bit more about what is the job of the therapist in working with a depressed patient, right? So Howe will say in a provocative sort of way, right, to keep the patient alive. But what he's also saying in relation to that is to give the patient time to have what D.W. Winnicott would call a holding environment, that you create a holding environment for the patient to come in and experience themselves and to give attention to their depression and to provide a space for the depression to work itself through. And so one of the things that Hal says too is that with depression, everything is kind of brought together. And so the idea ultimately is to use discursive practice to describe the lived experience in detail. And so he talks about the cycle of things falling apart and things coming back together again, things dissolving, things coming back together, solva et coagula in many ways, right? So this process, and he doesn't use those terms, but he describes it in different ways. This process is something that can be seen in the experience of depression. And it's the phase that you're talking about, where it's to keep the patient alive, is when they're in this negredo kind of phase, this blackening phase where things are dissolving. And if one literalizes the experience, one concretizes it, it could mean to that person that they're going to die or they want to die. So the idea is to have a much more, I would say, symbolic, even metaphorical, and ultimately metacognitive perspective on that, to see the process itself, to watch it, to observe it, and to allude to its healing agent. Because ultimately, depression is in the service of healing. Something needs to fall apart. Something needs to die. something needs to dissolve, right? And Howe talked a lot about depression as sort of a negative relationship to reality in many ways, where one doesn't have a right relationship to reality. And so one engages in fantasy. One has these identifications with fantasized objects, either internally or externally, and relates to sort of false constructs about the world.
And what's more dangerous, the fantasy or the identification?
I would say in many ways, it's the identification that tends to be a little bit more dangerous when that's concerned, because these are all, like he talks about, the protective function of fantasy, the protective function of identification, right? And so the idea is to protect the person from pain, to protect the person from suffering, but it's through this illusory kind of path. And ultimately, what he gets at is this practice of acceptance, this practice of submission, where one accepts reality, one accepts one's condition, one accepts one's lived experience as it is, and withdraws in many ways the projections, and in many ways sees through the fantasy. And the idea is to allow yourself to experience these painful emotions that you wanted to disavow and push away. And so that's why it's so important for the therapist to have this safe container, what Winnicott would call this holding environment, because the patient is going to be invited to experience feelings that they may have repressed, feelings that they may have pushed away, and they need to do that in a manner that's safe and in with someone who's safe.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been through that in the therapeutic process in therapy
Mhm.
myself, so I'm very familiar with the power of it and how also how unaware a lot of people might be that it can work that way and be useful in that way.
Very
Um,
much so.
Also learned a good lesson about that from a druid, another a fellow bard once during my decade as a professional bard, though I'm still very much a musical person. And it was he's explained it in the idea of congruency, especially with like playing shows. Just be where you're at, be who you are. And the more true in alignment you are with that, the more you'll connect with people and the more they'll appreciate and especially even support you. Whereas
Absolutely.
if you're trying to perform above your level or anything of that variety, there's a fracturing that goes on, and it can absolutely lead to all kinds of feelings, whether it's imposter syndrome or
Mhm.
depression or despair or anger or well, I'm the world's done me wrong, where the truth is
Yeah.
maybe you just still sort of suck and you need to get better. So practice more. And that was indeed usually the lesson, not just in music, but in most things I've encountered in life. And
Yeah.
depression is such a big topic. I love how you describe it. Was it you or How who describes it as a clock? But I think it's How and you who describe, in particular, the bardic foil in a way to depression, or at least a tool to work with it, which is poetic relanguaging.
That's
And of
exactly right.
course, as a musical and poetical person, I love that immensely. And and it speaks to the power of the bardic magic and stories, and how powerful stories are, of course, not just in our psychological lives or within academic intertextuality, but for the whole world, for the global political and societal framework that we live in, right? It's all
For sure.
stories, and if we didn't know that before the age of AI, I think will clarify it immensely.
Yeah, I was struck once to your point about this sort of bardic or poetic re-narrativizing or retelling of a story, right? So James Hillman, the founder of archetypal psychology, who was a very close associate supervisor and mentor to Stan Marlin, who was my mentor, said that the patient has to learn to sing their symptoms, right? And that struck me when I first heard that, because it's provocative, right? And Hillman is known for making these very provocative, evocative kinds of statements, right? Because his whole idea is not to take something and reduce it to its essential core, right? But to keep it in this poetic, soulful kind of language. And so if you invite a patient to sing their symptoms, to poeticize their symptoms, they cease being symptoms, but they become song. And so imagine working with a depressed patient where the goal isn't to cure them of the depression, but to invite them to a new way of experiencing their depression through re-narrativizing it through poetic discourse. And so the idea too is that the soul is naturally inclined towards poetic discourse. And so for a lot of people, it doesn't take as much prompting as you would think, but just an invitation. And sometimes when the therapist, him or herself, hears a patient say something about their lived experience, you might reflect that experience back in a more poetic way, but in a way that's congruent with their actual lived experience. So they see themselves through a different mirror, something different being reflected back to them. And so the more they can poeticize, symbolize, translate into metaphor, use spiritual discourse, contemplative discourse, philosophic discourse to talk about their experience, the less symptomatic it actually becomes.
It seems that's tied to your idea of sort of not reducing even the spiritual path you're on to becoming like the thing. You don't want to become like Christ or like Buddha. You want to, how would you describe that in this context? How is that? It's not it's I don't think it's a reduction to say like Christ or like Buddha, but you're talking about taking it to some would see it as maybe a more Gnostic and occult extreme, but
Absolutely.
psychologically, it does seem very in line with the ideas of either actualization or transcendence, probably depending on what school you come out of.
For sure. Yeah. So the idea, and I know which part of the book that you're referencing with that, it's in some way to become a Buddha, to become a Christ, to become a Krishna, to become a Lao Tzu, in which means like, so if you think about contemplative Christianity, for instance, St. Paul talks about this idea of putting on the mind of Christ, right? So that's right in the scriptures.
One of my
You
favorite
have to
lines.
put mine too, putting on the mind of Christ, which means in many ways to see and experience the world through the mind of Christ, which is integral to your own nature. So one of the things that I've also done recently in my book on Kenneth Grant and the Vulture's Cry, Being a Non-Being and Occult Experience, Volume 3, is I looked at this idea of the mob zone or the zones of mob that Grant talks about. And he also talks about the zone of Zoskia. And so if you pay attention to his discourse, you pay attention to his language, what he's saying is that these are perspectives. These are ways of experiencing the world comparable to a mind of Christ. And so when you think about like the zones of Mav, the mind of Christ, Buddha nature, all of these things, they're progressive levels of non-duality. Like the deeper you go into this mind of Christ, for instance, the more the world becomes non-dual, right? And you see this as something that's evident in a lot of the contemplative traditions and a lot of the esoteric traditions, and that there's this move towards increasing non-duality, right? And so for me, that's an important experience to talk about because in many ways, it's sort of the goal, if you will, or the objective, but without reducing it, right? So these are like irreducible kinds of notions where they're inexhaustible. And the image always remains somewhat elusive the more you try to capture it and the more you try to pin it down, it'll escape you. And I think for me, that's a good thing because it always keeps you sort of chasing after it, exploring it. It's never exhaustible. It's something that you can probe for the rest of your existence.
Being is that which retreats from us.
Always retreats from us. It's like playing hide and seek with God.
I would, yes. Let's dive more into the Austrage in a bit. On the before we leave depression and this sort of thing behind. becoming Christ or becoming Buddha or becoming a thing, it seems like there are dangers on that path, and one of them might be object identification. Is that the case, do you think, or
No, I think you're
am I into
right.
something, or I don't know.
Yeah, there's always a risk of ego inflation, right? When one kind of explores those notions, right? To kind of identify, let's say, with Christ, or to identify with the Buddha, which in some ways could mean that the ego itself identifies and then assumes what they believe to be the personality of the Godhead. And then you're moving more into the realm of fantasy, where you're more and more detached from reality. Even though you believe you're firmly immersed in reality, you're actually detached from it. So for Howe, that would actually be called more of a fantasy and an object identification that could lead to ego inflation. But the idea too is ultimately to know that this is irreducible to any personality. So the Christ nature is something that's accessible to all. And so what does that mean to possess that? Right? That's what you have to explore, you know? And so one of the things I like about Druidic thinking, especially through the lens of John Michael Greer, is this idea that the binary is actually important, right? So something is always paired with its opposite. And so when you do that, in my opinion, the danger of ego inflation becomes less and less because there's always something that anchors the flight towards spirit that's grounded in the earth. And so whatever that can be for the individual person, that's something that's very earth-based versus very air-based. But the idea is to become giant-like so that your feet on the ground and your head is in the clouds, but you're connected to both worlds in many ways. And so it's always important to have grounding techniques to prevent ego identification and to be just plain humble, right? You know, to know that ultimately this nature is inexhaustible, and to become Christ-like or to become a Christ is to in many ways practice and walk the path that Christ walked, you know, to take up the cross, if you will.
It just occurred to me that maybe one of the reasons I'm attracted to things like Enochian and other complex forms of magic is because they're inherently humbling, right? Not just the scope alone is too much for anyone to take on in a lifetime, right? So right from the outset, you can't fully do it. Plus, since the thing is not a theory in its essence anyway, but a practice, you can't fully do that either. So there's this enforced humility every time you thumb through an Ashmolean manuscript or try to take on one of Dee's charts,
Mhm.
which are fun. But then it simplifies the second you go into a procedure in which you're, you know, avoiding coitus and gluttony and preparing yourself for communion with the spirit of some part of the earth, perhaps. Um, and then you just have a very real lived experience. And yeah, so the balance, the theory, it can act in occultism as a foil to some of the dangers of practice. This is a revelation. Thank you.
Yeah,
Something
good
emerged
stuff.
between us here. The first thing of
The
tremendous value.
dialectic.
Yeah. All right. Depression. Yeah, let's see. On depression. I think that's all the notes I had. But what interests me also about the depression aspect on that is it seems tied to his analysis of war in a very interesting way. And that,
Mhm.
I mean, I would love to talk a bit about War Dance and not only why that book's not in print either, but I'd like to talk a bit more about the meta of it all and why it is he seems he wasn't simply suppressed because he was challenging prevailing Jungian and Freudian systems, was he? Because he
Well, not
founded the
entirely.
Tavistock Clinic, right? He was a major guy in the
He
UK.
was a major figure.
He fired R.D. Laing for exploring psychedelics. Um,
He definitely disapproved of that.
yeah, I wonder what he would think of my fellow Vancouverite here down the road, Gabor Mate's work. being done these days. I wonder if Gabor Mate could change Howe's mind on effective.
Well, and it does raise an interesting question if how we're alive today, though, right? In the 21st century, in 2023, moving on 2024, would he take up these subjects in the same sort of way, right? And so there's a way of even imaginatively modernizing how to say, okay, like with this subject that you just brought up, the use of psychedelics, right? So psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, even nowadays, is something that people are using, right? It's not something that is as anathema as it once was. So if he were alive today, would he take up this subject in the same way, almost as a form of spiritual bypass, right? Which is kind of what he alludes to when he's very critical of these sorts of practices. So I'm not so sure. I think there could be a way in which he would be more receptive in some ways, in the light of contemporary research,
And
in the
technology,
light,
right? Yeah.
for sure,
Mm.
for sure.
Are you a fan of much of what the folks at MAPS are doing?
Tell me more about that.
The MAPS organization, they're doing, I think mainly they're looking at curing PTSD in soldiers and
Oh
stuff like
yeah,
that with MDMA and other things,
yeah, for
which is
sure,
great. Yeah. Yeah.
for sure, absolutely. Yeah, and another thing too, and whether we get into this subject today or not, is the notion of, or the importance of taking care of the body, right? In terms of what more embodied somatic practice in the form of different physical exercises can do for the psyche, right? And so that's another part of the work, and how doesn't make explicit reference to this, but he talks about taking up one's psychological life in an athletic sort of way. So he refers to athleticism and discipline, right, as being important parts of working with psyche. But that could get us into a different subject matter. But it's equally important, in terms of talking about caring for the self.
How would you say he ideally saw that playing out in the lives of his patients?
Well, I mean, he talked about this athletic approach, if you will, in terms of discipline, right? So being disciplined, was an important part, I think, of approaching working with psychological life for Howe. And in some ways, maybe he saw individuals that were experimenting with psychedelics and other drugs as being undisciplined, right? As a form of spiritual bypass in some way, right? That there was something else going on psychologically, and they were using it as a way to take flight from reality. Because for Hal, the main thing was to have a congruent response to the real, right? A congruent response to the real world rather than a fantasized world. So anything that in some way would, in his mind, um, cloud one's judgment or project a world that wasn't true, for him, there was a danger in that, because the idea is to practice this form of acceptance, which involves acknowledging things as they really are, right? And so whether or not psychedelics put you in touch with a greater aspect of reality or a more congruent aspect of reality remains to be seen. But I think he saw it as basically a shortcut, right? And so for him, staying disciplined to this method of allowing psyche to give voice within the context of therapy in this unmediated sort of way with the assistance of the therapist and the holding environment was absolutely vital.
Yeah, I think his concerns are very valid. Obviously, I think that especially even not just entheogens, but spirituality in any of its forms can be used to bypass. Well, we can use almost anything to bypass anything. We're clever creatures, aren't we? But
Right.
so I think that's where the role of the psychologist does come in so valuably as a guide or in spiritual guidance, which is what clergy like me focus on, and we all have our little niches. Um, trying to help each other stay sort of balanced at that cross point, which I really love your analysis of uh, the liminal as the balancing cross point of that crossroads, right? The place between being and non-being where becoming happens. Literally, if my 13-year-old self was hearing us now, or had read access to those books back when I was that young, I would have been a very happy camper. I felt very it was very hard to find anything I was interested in intellectually as I was growing up. And I'm glad, that's one thing the internet sort of fixed for us, right? So at least now you can Google stuff and find a surplus of information.
Indeed.
Where back
Yeah.
then it was whatever they had at Cole's Books.
For sure.
That was not a big bookstore, my friend. That was not a big bookstore at all.
No, you have the entirety of the collective psyche in the form of the internet available to you.
Are you more excited or scared about it?
About what? The internet?
The internet and what's like and the future of it.
So, yeah, as a tool, I think it's certainly fine. But I'm very Heideggerian when it comes to this, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So, another influence on me is the work of Martin Heidegger. Being trained at Duquesne in their philosophy and psychology programs, I got a heavy dose of Martin Heidegger, both the early Heidegger and a little bit of the later Heidegger. And I studied a lot of the later Heidegger on my own, which I really do like. So he talks in some of his later essays and writings about the technological enframing of the individual, or the technological enframing of being, or Dasein, being there. And so I do worry about how one's engagement with a particular tool, with a particular technology, can function to transform one's being in the world so that one becomes machine-like, one becomes robotic-like, one becomes like the very tool that they are attempting to use in some way. And so if technology enframes what it means to be human, the only value gets placed on that which is calculative. And so the more qualitative sides of things, the more this idea of being kind of releasing itself, this idea of releasement or Gelassenheit, right, that Heidegger talks about and Meister Eckhart talked about before him, being in many ways becomes concealed or veiled or skewed through it being technologically enframed. And so I do worry about those sorts of things. And so you can see, people in many ways becoming desouled, denatured, despirited, focusing only on that which can be calculated, and only calculative thought versus meditative thought is of any value. Poesis is no longer valuable, right? The divinities have taken flight from the world, right? All of these things that he's talked about. And then he says only a God can save us in this provocative sort of way, right? And so I take these subjects up from that point of view. So I do have some concerns, yes.
Yeah, interesting. No, thanks for sharing that perspective and your analysis. I'm sure we can all extract from it some things. Yeah, the internet. Oh well, I'm glad it exists because I mean, it was a blessing in the 90s when it came along. It allowed me to actually get out of the little suburb I lived in and participate in the magical world. Probably, at just the right time for me. I was young, but just the right time.
Mhm.
I grew up in a Maharishi family. From
Oh,
my parents
cool.
they were the anti-drug, anti-drink, vegan Maharishi parents of the 60s, 70s. So it was a very, no familiarity with Christianity or anything like that as a child. Um,
Hmm.
until I went to Missouri. That
And
was a
that's when you
shock.
discovered the word.
That was when I discovered that saying shut up to my cousin could get me paddled by my uncle, the Reverend Bud Hill.
Oh, that kind of variant of Christianity.
Yeah. All right. Maybe I can dive into you talked a bit about Heidegger and going back to that point. Um, God, there's so much I want to cover. Forgive me if I get a little lost from overexcitement here. All right, can we talk a bit, touch on Corelli,
Yeah,
and
I
and
will
spare in a
follow
bit of
your
that,
lead for sure, for sure.
and we'll get back to Graham Howe, who I do want to also add. I didn't realize he had such a sense of humor till the end of your book, in which you know what I'm talking about, right? Like clearly he doesn't expect anyone to sit down to meditate with milk on the stove boiling away. And it was the
No,
first time I had a sense of like a sort of humor, even above and beyond what I was expecting, and get a glimpse in. It was a very nice, friendly thing to have at the end of the book, amidst his teaching, his practice,
right.
because yeah, just this, and the other little joke he makes is what was it? It was what's the boiling milk in the other one? I forget it now. It's right at the end of the book, but yeah, it's such a. Do you know if was he considered a gregarious
Yeah,
fun
I
guy to
think
be
from
around
the
and
little that I know about his biography, yeah, I think there's a way in which, there was sort of a lightness to his way of being. There was a gregarious side of his personality, because I think that's all part of being congruent with what is real, right? And so if there's an affect, for instance, that requires levity, that requires humor. The idea is to give voice to that, to express that, and to even find the humor in that which is serious, right? When one takes themselves too seriously, or when one takes what is studying too seriously, one can balance that with a little levity, with a little humor, right? And it kind of, again, shows this notion of the binary in some way, that everything is about balance, that to anything to an extreme can become problematic. And so I like when authors, for instance, will, you know, throw in subtle jokes, in the midst of a very serious discourse or a serious reflection, right? One of my favorite, and this relates to it in some way. So Jacques Derrida, right, founder of deconstruction,
oui, oui.
who I did have a chance to meet in 1999 at a conference at Villanova University called God and Postmodernism 2, where he gave a talk on forgiveness. Um, he was once asked, he said, someone asked him in an interview, they said, you know, if you can ask Heidegger any question, if he were to be here right now, what would you want to know about him? He goes, thought about it for a little bit. He goes, want to know about his sex life. And I'm thinking, like, this is fucking great. This guy, and he's like, you know what? You notice that philosophers never talk about sex. Like, what was he like in the bedroom? And I thought this was amusing, but at the same time, it was absolutely brilliant. Because when you think about it, it's like Heidegger, sex. Do you put them together? I would want to know about that too, right? And so he gave voice, I think, to something that in many ways was humorous, but at the same time raised an important question about the repressed body in Heidegger's work, right? The idea that sex is something that isn't necessarily disclosed or talked about when he talks about being or being in the world or Dasein. It doesn't get discussed within the context of sex. So I thought it was a fascinating sort of question. If anything he wanted to know, it would be about Heidegger's sex life. Of all the
Hmm.
things you can ask Heidegger, what was he like in the bedroom?
Yeah, wild. I can't. Well, yeah, and it's pretty incredible. You got to meet Mr. Jacques himself. That's
1999.
yeah, yeah. That's fabulous. Yeah, what a what a thing. It was a sad. I remember I was sad the day I was in grad school when he died, and I remember someone telling me he had passed, and I was like, oh, that is sad. It's it's been hard since, honestly, I'm just going to be blunt, actually. It's been very hard since university because I've noticed, like, I don't take anyone I read undigested or unfiltered, but the hatred towards Derrida I've encountered from the world has been shocking, given
Hmm.
how much he was considered a thinker worth studying in university. Like, this guy's kind of intense. Maybe you should read him. And so, de la grammatologie, and you read it and you looked at the repercussions of it, and some of his stuff, like his dialogues with Caputo on like the danger of community over hospitality, I thought was not just brilliant, but downright prophetic of our
Yeah.
current situation.
Yeah, I completely 110% agree with all of that. For me, like if I think about my own methodology in some way, right? Not only in letter, but in spirit. And in volume 1 and volume 2, in particular of the being and non-being series, I actually call my methodology informed by something that I've described as occult grammatology, right? And so I'm very much influenced by Derrida. And one of the things I like about Derrida is that he can take one sentence or one word and write 100 pages about it, right? It doesn't have to be this exegesis of an entire text, but the word itself, the phrase itself. And so for me, like when I do my so-called commentaries, like on Crowley and on Spare, that's kind of what I do in many ways. Like I'm looking at a word or I'm looking at a phrase and I'm looking at it from this grammatological kind of point of view. So I'm sticking with the words. I'm looking at what's present. I'm looking at what's absent. I'm not necessarily looking for hidden or esoteric meaning because that's been done before, right? And looking at various occult texts. I'm actually trying to approach it in a way that kind of removes this idea of an absolute, that removes this idea of this totalitarian form of meaning that underlies the structure of the world. So I've called it, like, especially in volume 2, kind of following Georges Bataille, this post-death of God mysticism, this look at non-knowledge, a metaphysics of absence versus presence. So I weave Derrida into all of that and look at Spare and Crowley and other people through these lenses, right? And so I'm just having fun doing it. Like they say, why are you doing it? Well, it's just fun. It's pleasurable. I enjoyed it. Let's see what happens.
Yeah. On the magic.tv interview you did on YouTube, which everyone should check out. I said I would shout it out because it's gotten woefully there were some technical difficulties at the beginning, and unfortunately I think a lot of people tune out when they hear that. They just go, oh,
Yeah.
it's like, oh, no, because the questions were actually really wonderful from the fellow, and your answers were outstanding. I really enjoyed it. Plus, you took care of a bunch of the things that everyone wants to know. That way, I don't have to ask them to you. You can go check out the some of the common questions, like whether are you more psychological or spirit model,
Oh
and
yeah,
the
right,
answer to
right,
that
right.
was really nice. And now we don't have to talk about it, which is great because you and I can talk about move on to Husserl more and
Right.
Nietzsche and Derrida. Here's some speaking of Crowley and Spare. What would do you think Spare would say if you asked him what's in a name?
Oh, so that for me also is sort of a Derridian kind of question as well, like what is actually in a name, right? And so for me, that is a question that has haunted me in many ways, right? Like what is in a name? And so I've almost become obsessed with that question. And so in some way, shape, or form, I try to respond to that question in every single book I write. And I still, in many ways, haven't exhausted that particular topic, right? And so what's interesting about Spare that I really like, and something that I've done with volume 2, right? So I'm looking at this idea of the creation of a sigil, right? And so I'm thinking like, okay, what would it be like to sigilize desire itself, right? And so not just because in many ways, like especially like in the Book of Pleasure, he talks about like this way of approaching sigils that's almost like for the commonplace that everybody sort of knows about, right? This idea that you sort of take a desire, you reconfigure it, you eliminate repetitive letters, you put it in the form of the symbol, you bury it, you forget it, and there somehow whatever it is that you desire, because you've repressed it, now all of a sudden has a chance for manifesting itself. which in many ways is an inversion of what you would expect in psychoanalysis, right? The idea is to make the unconscious conscious. And what Spare does, which I think is really interesting, is that you make the conscious unconscious. And I think for me, that is one of the more fascinating aspects of his work from a depth psychological point of view, because he's kind of taking Freud and turning Freud on its head by saying, no, your core tenet in psycho, and here, look at my background. It's Austin Osman Spare's Portrait of Sigmund Freud, 1955, right? So here we are, we're speaking about all of this. It's all kind of coinciding now, right? So the inversion of desire itself in some ways can lead to, in my opinion, the name, right? In terms of what is it that names itself when desire in some ways is repressed? What comes forth to name itself from the unconscious itself? So when you talk about like magical names or sorceress names, names that have been given to one, that take on a magical kind of meaning, is this a name that comes from the ego? Is this the name that comes from the conscious? Or is it coming from the unconscious in some way? Or is it coming from this realm that Spare calls betweenness, or the neither, right? And so when one names something, or one is given a name, does this name in some way speak to the reality of the unconscious? Or is it in some way something even beyond that, right? Because naming is important. When you name something, when you give something a term, there's a way in which the idea is that the name itself corresponds to the experience that you're trying to describe. But in many ways, whatever it is that you're trying to describe, it's elusive. You can't entirely name or describe something in its entirety, because as soon as you do, the meaning escapes itself. So in naming, there's always something that's absent. There's always something that's not there. And for me, the question, what is in a name, is what is absent from the name itself, which is what I'm trying to actually look at, and trying to find a way to use language to describe what that experience of that which is outside the name actually is.
Yeah, that's you hear that, everybody? Good. It's 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 a it's a Yuletide uh gift to bring these ideas to everyone this holiday season, and invite them to challenge their eggnog brains with some heavy thoughts. It's it's great to hear you talking about the things I love so much. I've got somewhere over here. I've got some Paul Ricoeur,
Oh,
who
good, good.
was kind of saved me after I read Derrida in grad school. I there was some, Paul Ricoeur saved me in a way from some of the darkness of Derrida and Heideggerian thought. Not the darkness in their thought, but the darkness that sort of swirls around like trickster spirits willing to play with you and challenge your most firmly held beliefs, just to see if they can get a reaction for perhaps no other reason than the reaction. And then you get to recur, and he brings you this idea of beauty back into the picture, and not just uh lack. And I don't mean lack as in a judgmental way, but in the
Well, the
philosophical
Lacanian idea of
in
lack.
the Lacanian, yeah. Well, the script going on in my brain this whole time we've been talking from the beginning, of course, is very Lacanian. That's how sort of I'm often making sense of things, because I really do enjoy the structure of the symbolic order and the imaginary and the real that he presents.
And here's another one for you in relation to Lacan. A longtime professor and a former professor of mine here at Duquesne was Bruce Fink. And you should be familiar with Bruce Fink because he translates Lacan into English, right? So if you look at your écrit, you look at who the translator is, that's Bruce Fink. You look at all the seminars that have been translated into English, that's Bruce Fink. So I had the privilege to actually learn some Lacan under him as well. So I
Mhm.
feel very fortunate in many ways. And so Lacan actually informs a lot of my thought and a lot of my work, especially with Being and Non-Being Volume 2. I look at jouissance and feminine jouissance in relation to Spare's work. And I read Spare through that lens and also through the lens of Pierre Klazowski, Georges Bataille, and Nietzsche are the people that I bring to my understanding of Spare.
Yeah. As you know, I go into jouissance in my in my master's thesis, as well as Nietzsche. Um, and I'm almost losing a thought there, but no. Okay. Maybe would you like to talk a bit about the idea of feminine jouissance? Is You're the first person on the podcast for sure who's known what I'm talking about when I say jouissance. Sometimes I throw it in there just because the idea to me is so powerful, especially how in coming out of a sort of nature natured conception of pre-semiotic becoming, similar to the way you frame these things. Again, we're very, you know, if you're part of a school of thought, I'm definitely, definitely a card-carrying member of that school. Let's
I
face
can
it.
tell.
I try to pretend that I still have the same respect for Hume that I did as a teenager, but I just don't. I mean, Hume, I was definitely taught by a Humean when I was starting out, but I was also taught by a Nietzschean who specialized in W.B. Yeats. So that's a weird combination. And
I love it.
throw in Waldorf school, and you've got me.
I
Um,
love it.
a
I
little
think it's great.
Golden Dawn sprinkling on the top,
I
and
love it. I think it's
great,
wonderful.
great. Someone, yeah. The feminine jouissance. What should people understand by this, and what threads do you think that listeners who are new to this idea might pull to find things of interest and illumination to them?
Well, one of the things that I find fascinating about feminine jouissance is that Lacan doesn't have a lot to say about it. It's almost something that, in many ways, fell outside of the psychoanalytic paradigm, right? And so he did liken it to mystical experience. And he talked about it looking at sort of the mystical ecstasy of St. Teresa of Avila. So he kind of looked at her contemplative experience and said that it was analogous to what he would call feminine jouissance. So he talks about the symbolic order quite a bit, as you know, throughout his works. But what I found fascinating, and he didn't say too much about it, he said feminine jouissance is of the infinite order, right? And I thought that was just absolutely fascinating. And I'm like, okay, and say more about that. And there was really never anything more to that. And I'm like, wow, well, that's really interesting. So, how can I move this idea further? So, one of the things that I did, I looked at, I'm also a huge proponent of Georges Bataille's work, especially the Summa Atheologica, which is kind of his inversion of St. Thomas's Summa Theologica, where with Bataille it begins with his book Inner Experience, Guilty, and then on Nietzsche, and then the fourth volume is the Unfinished System of Non-Knowledge. So I look at feminine jouissance as this, what Bataille would talk about as non-knowledge, right? Or this idea where there's this mysticism that's almost about like pure becoming, something that escapes language, something that escapes the word, something that escapes the signifier, something that the signifier can't entirely capture, but it's something that's even more embodied. Like people think that it's oftentimes that which transcends the body, but I think it's something deeply embodied. I think it's of the flesh. I think it's so of the flesh that it helps us to reimagine what pleasures of the flesh actually are. Because if you look at the description of St. Teresa's mystical ecstasy, it's an orgasm. It's like an orgasm that she's talking about, like having sex with the divine. And so in many ways, it's like, well, what is feminine jouissance? Well, it would almost be like having sex with the divine, if you can imagine what that is. And many mystics in some ways describe it in such a way where it's like bordering on the erotic, where the erotic and the transcendental, the transcendent, the transgressive all kind of intertwine in some meaningful way. And it's neither transgressive nor transcendent. It's nor spirit nor soul, but it's something that's absolutely in between all of that. And it's that which escapes the word. And in many ways, that's why I think Lacan didn't have the nomenclature, because he was very much a Freudian. You know, he says, I'm a Freudian. And
Oh yeah.
basically, what I'm doing is Freudian psychoanalysis. And I'm returning to Freud. It was all about this return to Freud from Lacan. But he paid careful attention to the signifier and its relationship to the signified. But feminine jouissance was something that went outside of the symbolic order. So, what language would you use to actually describe it? And so, for me, rather than going in the direction of the absolute, you know, as a divine presence, for me, I imagine this is more of a mysticism without the absolute, a mysticism without God as the absolute, a mysticism in the wake of the death of God as the Nietzschean event that Bataille and Klosowski and many others have talked about. What does contemplative practice, what does spirituality, what does mysticism look like in the wake of God's death? That for me is another burning interest.
Absolutely. And especially given the nature of the kind of God Nietzsche wasn't in particular talking about as a doorway to the indictment of the pietism and sort of pretense of his day. Um, I had a dark thought. Well, it's a funny thought about the feminine jouissance, but also as the thing that takes you out. Um, but it's not a departure into the imaginary order, we would agree,
No, not at
right?
all.
Um, and that leaves us with, other than the symbolic, just one thing, which hits hard if you approach it in the wrong way, shall we say, like by jumping off a building, it hits
Right.
hard.
Yeah.
But
Well, that's what Deleuze did, right?
yeah.
So we think about the way Deleuze had died, you know, that was sort of what happened, right?
Oh,
So
I
there
don't know
was,
how he died.
yeah, from what I know, he jumped off a building.
He really wanted to test out if the real was real, was real, the really real. Oh wow.
Very, perhaps. Um,
Well, that's sort of what I think is Badiou who says, like, yeah, if you want to know what's actually real, jump off a building.
yes,
You know,
yes,
that's
absolutely.
it's not everything symbolic.
No, not at all. And in many ways, it transgresses the symbolic order, and there's no real nomenclature to describe that which transgresses the symbolic order. And that's what I'm trying to do, actually. Like when I'm writing this being and non-being series, I'm experimenting and exploring different ways of describing this infinite order of things, that which I believe transgresses the symbolic order. And it takes you to the point in many ways where you stretch the word to its absolute maximum, its absolute limit, right? And so I'm experimenting with stylized ways of writing, stylized ways of thinking, you know, all kind of pointing to something, but never firmly grasping it, but being okay with that at the same time.
And I love that you take aesthetics as seriously as I think as deadly seriously as we need to take it. And I guess one of probably one of my main influences would be Echo for that reason. When in first year college, I read his Aesthetics of Thomas Aquinas and was like, oh my God.
Mm.
Um, I was thinking about Martin Luther's Revelation as well, which was like the opposite of feminine jouissance on his porta potty and his famous epiphany. If there's a dark masculine twin to the feminine jouissance, it's probably that. And followed by diatribes against devils dancing on the rooftops of Jews as he goes by in his carriage, right?
Very
Some
much
heavy.
so.
Do you ever wonder if we'd just be in a better place in the world if he had actually followed through and cut out Revelation, and then it wouldn't have been in the Protestant Bible at all? What do you think? I rarely have people that I would want to hear the answer to that question from, but you're one of them.
Oh, wow. That's a really good question.
Because he
You know,
hated it. He thought it should be cut out, and people persuaded him to leave it in, and he relented. And since I learned that, I haven't been able to stop thinking about it for like 25 years.
yeah, and so I wonder what that means too about the whole idea of the prophetic, right? And the whole notion of revelation itself and the apocalypse, right? The meaning of apocalypse would be to reveal. And like you think too, like, all right, phenomenologically, what's that about? This idea of revelation and this idea of an experience in time of something that is futural, something that's anticipated. And so, how does it speak about a dialogue with time, where someone has an experience of an event that's not yet? And so, I'm looking at it from a point of view where I'm thinking, like, well, what would be the meaning of taking revelation out of the scripture? And how would that change the way we relate in some ways to Christianity if something like that were removed? And does that mean you start taking out all the prophets? Do you start going through the Old Testament and you start removing all the prophets there? This whole idea of the prophetic being kind of excised. No, I think for me, like you have to leave something like that in, right? It's vitally important to keep something like that in, as crazy as it might be, and I don't think it is, to be honest with you. I think there's a lot of validity to all of that, even if it's just this stylized way of thinking and writing and having an experience of something and translating it into the terms that make sense for you. I think it's important that we leave things like that in the Bible and in all texts that have this prophetic kind of spirit. What would the world be like without prophets, without seers, without poets, without visionaries, without madmen, without mad women, without people that are having transpersonal, transcendental experiences? Like for me, there's a danger in wanting to remove something like that.
Yeah, yeah. It's made it a more interesting world, that's for sure. Um, yeah, good old Book of Revelation. All right, I have well, we're still in Crowley, before we move on too much to Crowley, but feminine jouissance, it's transformative. Like, how much of that, given the embodied sexual elements at play within any form of jouissance, whether it's fully transcendental and spiritual, or even just sexual. Um, I mean, how much is the possibility that the transformation is just the encounter with the real, right? Like, and sort of an aporia from that,
Mhm.
that symbolic structure, because symbolic orders, they never really survive encounter with the real, right? They cause rupture and what are some of the fancy words that we use for that stuff? There's a bunch of these terms that we use for, when discussing these radical encounters between the different orders of relevance in Lacanian or Zizekian thought, right? And they're fun ones. But do you think the feminine jouissance is that an encounter with the real?
Yeah, as much as you can talk about what the real actually is, right? So there's this idea of the real being irreducible ultimately. And so there's an encounter with, like, I would liken it to an encounter with the nothingness, with like the void, right? With the abyss in some way, if you want to use terms in that way. So what happens? What form of pleasure occurs when one encounters the real, right? And so when we think of jouissance, well, we think of pleasure kind of intermixed with pain in some way. There's always an element of pain that's sort of involved in all of that. And so in that encounter, the structures that one uses to understand reality dissolve to a certain extent. And one emerges from that encounter not the same as one is before. And so my question is, how does one intentionally, volitionally have these types of experiences where one places themselves in a position to encounter or experience the real? And for me, it's through contemplative or mystical practice, through esoteric practice. Regardless of the signifiers that get used, this is a way of encountering the real in its very different forms.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, nothing wrong with using cataphasis to find the abyss, right? You gotta have some sort of map, even if it's not the terrain.
Right. And what kind of subjectivity do you experience when you engage in a certain practice? Back to what we were talking about prior to the interview, this idea of becoming what Foucault would call the ethical subject. How do you find yourself in the activity that you're engaging in? And so with these practices, how do they transform subjectivity? That's my fundamental question regarding all of these kinds of practices. And that's why I would experiment with any and almost all of them, just because of the effect that it has on my own subjectivity. Who do I become when I practice in this way? How does my world shift and change?
Yeah, yeah, I mean, obviously, that's what matters to me too.
For
Having seen
sure.
all the badiou in my thesis and work, and I mean, for me, a mystical experience is defined by its transformational element, and that's also wrapped up in right relationship and uh sort of accept the event of truth, of that being not a simulacrum of transformation or false or temporary, or something that you deny later on and then realize you were mistaken. But yeah, profound fundamental change, and we see this happening all the time in magical and mystical practices, as well as in things like sex, right?
Yes.
I think Hemingway would be very proud of us right now. I mean, one of the things you could say is that you achieved that state, that embodied state of encountering the nothing of the real, in even really good sex. That would be
Yeah.
that's literally, I think Hemingway literally said that, without all the philosophy and no commas or
Yeah.
adjectives, of course.
Yeah. The idea of the nothing of the real, the desert of the real is another way of kind of describing that in some ways. Through sexual practice, through mystical or contemplative practice, these are all avenues for, in my opinion, experiencing that. And then noting the shift that occurs in one's subjectivity as a result of that. That for me is the most powerful part of it. The subjectivity involved that comes from engaging in these practices. That's why I like experimentation. I encourage people to explore, to experiment, and in some ways not to take them too seriously. It's not always about like trying to find a hidden truth or an essence behind the practice. Why can't one do it just because of its pleasure, just because of its jouissance, just because of its enjoyment? That's why I do it, purely.
Oui. And
Oui,
and
oui,
and that mentality is so crucial to avoid the dangers of identification with the thing you're doing, right?
exactly.
And placing all your eggs in that basket, in titles, in names, and accomplishments, rather than the current lived experience you're having right now, and how the previous ones have led you to this one, and how this one might lead you to more fullness and pleroma in the future.
Right. Yeah. So for me, it's kind of like removing the absolute from the equation, right? Removing this idea that I'm trying to find something underneath the surface, that I'm trying to disclose this hidden truth. But as I said, it's about enjoyment, it's about pleasure, it's about experiment, it's about a stylized, artful way of living, of being, of expressing oneself. And all of these practices lead to these kinds of transformations, inevitably. And for me, this is the spirit in which I take them up.
Yeah. And I know we haven't said the word ecstasy, I think, at all yet, but for those listening who might not be familiar with this, we're definitely talking more in terms of, along the lines of ecstasis rather than debauchery
Mhm.
when we talk
That's
about
right.
jouissance, which means sort of joyfulness or pleasure in French,
Yes.
for some folks who might be just wondering what the
What are
hell's
they talking? Yeah,
happening
it's true.
here.
We haven't said what that is yet.
How can we? How can we?
Okay.
Um, I don't even know where to go from here. I have a bunch of questions, but we're also just having fun. So,
Indeed.
incredible. Let's yeah, all this from what it's in a name, hey? Um,
Yeah. And still, we haven't answered the question.
how can we?
We can't.
Yeah, we can't. It's well, not only because it's always retreating from us, but because the question is different when we ask it again as a new person that we've become through answering it the last time.
That's Heraclitus for you, right? There's a way in which you never step into the same river twice because you change and the river is constantly changing. So you're never asking the same question, even though the question seems like it's the same. And you're never going to answer it in the same way. It's an infinite postponement of meaning. Meaning is always deferred.
Yeah. What's it? What's it? The incoming of the other, l'avenir, or something like that.
Incoming of the other.
Incoming. I haven't said that phrase in like 16 years.
Well, congratulations.
L'avenir, really. Yeah, thank you. Um, I was gonna say something about more about that, but yeah, the all right. Where does the Gnostic element come into play in what you call your occult grammatology?
Yeah, so for me, like when I look at it from that point of view, so when Gnosticism, for instance, is kind of looked at from this grammatological point of view, or even the other way around in some way, because I try to bring all of these things together. Um, Occult grammatology, Gnosticism, and what I call like a participatory epistemology, this idea that one co-creates knowledge by way of participating, right? So I'm participating in the reading of the text, but I'm also allowing the text in some ways to read me, which is an interesting inversion. And that gets to the idea that many of the archetypal psychologists talk about, is that when there's an imaginal being or an imaginal figure, or there's this idea, there's a way in which you are being looked at from the perspective of the idea, right? You are being looked at from the perspective of the image. You're not just looking at and looking through the image is also looking at and through you. And so that in many ways captures this idea of this participatory epistemological approach that I talk about. Um, but ultimately for me, when I think about Gnosticism, it's the idea that Jung talked about. Like when Jung was asked that famous question, right, in his BBC interview, Dr. Jung, do you believe in God? Right? And do you remember what he says? He goes, no, I don't believe, I know. And so Gnosticism is this path through knowledge, knowing the divine experience. It's through experience. It's through knowing in a participatory experiential way, not necessarily through faith, not necessarily through belief. And so when Jung talks about it, it's like, this is for me an experience. I've had the experience of the numinous. And therefore, when I talk about it, I talk about it from the point of view of knowing. But I go a step beyond that, because for me, it's also about unknowing, right? And it's also about non-knowledge. And it's also about the absence of the absolute when I'm talking about looking at these experiences through Bataille's work. And so when I think about knowing, I think about unknowing. When I think about knowledge, I think about non-knowledge. And so I'm always pairing things with its opposite so that in some way it keeps the space of desire open. So I never fully know something because I'm always pairing it with its opposite, which in some way, like when there's this idea, like just think about this notion of the adversary or oppositional power, the archetype of the adversary and how you might apply that, right? It's not just saying no, like in negative theology, God is not this, God is not that, but God is the opposite of this and that, right? Andrew Chumley talks about that in some of his works. It's not just no, it's opposition. It's the opposite. God is the opposite of anything that you can imagine, right? He cites a Sufi mystic in suggesting that. And for me, like that gripped me tremendously. Like, wait a minute. So there's a way in which if I claim to know God, what I claim to know is the very opposite of what I claim to know. And therefore it escapes meaning. And so you enter into the void, you enter into the abyss, you enter into the realm of the black sun, right? That's for me the territory where all of this is found. And the signifiers for that are sometimes these Luciferian, satanic, Lilith-like images, right? That I don't literalize or mythologize, but I
Yeah.
see them also as sort of ontological constructs.
It's the adversary at play, right? Shaitan and so
Yes,
these are things that even in the traditions are seen as serving God and a part of God and in relationship to God, not oppositional. It's one of the I always appreciated that. I think it's just a GD thing, but in the GD we always have a teaching that not to mistreat or abuse unclean spirits, lower spirits, chthonic ones that you might need to be careful with. Still don't
mhm.
mistreat them because they are too are holy and serve the one true Lord our God, or something like
Yeah.
that. And I always liked that
Lovely.
mentality. I always thought that was a very it was an impressive mentality. um and yeah, and of course, so yeah, I could say more on GD interpretations, of course, but what stood out from what you're saying there is how that's even what your description is contained even in the idea of the monad and the point within the circle,
Mm,
or Newton Hadith, right? The one is the other and the other is the one, but the two aren't the same and can't actually know each other, otherwise they cease to be what they are, right?
that's right.
But what the difference between a point and a circle or a sphere is essentially nothing. And that's the word of the day. The
That
watchman.
is the word of the day. That's exactly right.
um how much does this, see how I'm going to lead this into our next thing, how much does that of this plays a role in Howe and his anti-systematic approach to psychoanalysis? Wasn't
Yeah. So
that fun? Wasn't
like
that wasn't that a great segue?
that was a great segue. Yeah. So in many ways, this adversarial spirit, if we want to look at it from that point of view, infuses Howe's own approach, right? Because when even with his work in the Tavistock Clinic, right, there was this anti-systematic kind of approach that was being applied. He was very, in many ways, phenomenological, very humanistic in his approach, but still very much adhered to the tenets of depth psychology. But what was happening was that psychoanalysis was becoming a dogma, right, at the time, with its in-group, with its out-group, with its adherents, with its followers, and it was developing a school. And in many ways, Freud became this revered sort of figure, right? This totem figure, this father figure, right? And so what ended up happening with Howe was that it wasn't that he had a distaste for psychoanalysis, but the way in which it was being taken up. And so if you read his work, it's what psychoanalysis would look like if it was, if the systematizing approach was taken away, if it wasn't a school of thought, if it wasn't a system of thought, if it was just ideas that were designed to help suffering souls and to bring them toward states of balance and wholeness, his is a psychoanalysis in some way that's stripped of any systematizing tendency. And so that adversarial oppositional spirit weaves through him, right? And so, like in the chapter on time and the unconscious, I talk about his dialogue with Jung, right? And so he challenges Jung. He takes Jung to
Oh yeah.
task. He says, look, your system is very four-dimensional. Like, because Howe is always talking about the three-dimensional versus the four-dimensional and beyond worlds, right? And he says, look, Dr. Jung, and I'm paraphrasing, right? Your system is four-dimensional, but you're describing it in a three-dimensional way. he takes him to task on that, challenges him.
Yeah, it's tantamount to just yeah, to, well, I mean, yeah, if you were to try and characterize that to someone on the street in modern language, you might have to say some harsh things to really deliver actually how significant it is what he was saying there to young. I mean, let's not read into it too far as calling so far as calling Young a fraud or anything like that, but he was definitely accusing him of perhaps, shall we say, cautioning, to use the old term applied to Edward Kelly and the like, and John Dee, even for any form of deception whatsoever, or mutation of truth and fact, right? Jung seemed to be afraid of the Freudians, if you ask me, and the fact that they, through their reductionist approach, they took all spirituality and made it a what's the word, a trans, not trans, it's I just pre you know,
Like the pre-trans fallacy.
yeah.
You're talking about like Ken
Well,
Wilber's idea.
just Freud's reduction of spiritual experiences to
Yeah, to like pre-personal experience in many.
pre-personal, that's the word. Sorry, yeah.
Yep. Yep. Yeah.
Sorry, it's early
Wilber
for me here,
wants
still on the West Coast.
No, that's perfectly fine. No, that's absolutely true. But what's interesting about Jung, so you have to read Jung's collected works differently now in the light of the Red Book, right? So in the light of the Red Book, in the light of the Seven Sermons to the Dead, which was published along with Memories, Dreams, and Reflections. But now that the Red Book has been published and now is widely consumed, you have to read all of the collected works differently. Because what you see in many ways, yeah, there was this fear in some ways of Freudians and orthodox psychoanalysis. But what he was trying to do was to explain the Red Book using analytic psychology. So if you look at all of the collected works, all of his scientific writings, all his Gnostic writings, all his alchemical works, all his works on psychotherapy, these are all ways of trying to explain what happened in the Red Book, right? Every single one. And so it's interesting that during that encounter that Howe had with him, there's a way in which Howe, without knowing it, was trying to solicit the Jung of the Red Book, just to say, look, I see in some way that this is a veneer, that this is a veil. Tell me what really is going on.
So he didn't know about the Red Book, but he sensed it
No,
was there. He sensed
no,
it.
for sure. He sensed that there was something there and that Jung wasn't being honest in his presentation, right? And so it was a very gentle, but at the same time, I think, powerful way of pointing in some way to that which was missing in Jung's discourse, which was soul, which was spirit, which was Philemon, the daimon, like all of this that really worked through Jung in the Red Book.
Yeah. How much of how, I mean, how much did Jung and Freud actually um get rid of patients because they didn't fit their own theories?
So that's a good question. Who were they as clinicians, right? Who were they as therapists, right? So a lot of the stories about Freud, which are actually quite interesting, there's enough of them to show how many times Freud went outside of psychoanalytic theory to help or treat patients. There were many ways in which he was very compassionate, he was very humane, he was very caring, he was very unsystematic in some ways, right? And
So
so there
willing
were
to
some
burn canoes,
deviances. Hmm?
willing to burn the canoe sometimes.
Yes, exactly. And so there were deviances in that regard. And the way that Jung approached therapy, so I love the way Jung approached psychotherapy. And my sense is that he wouldn't get rid of patients if they didn't fit his particular theory. And the reason why is this. because I think Jung was once known to have said, "I'm glad I'm not a Jungian," right? And so
Oh, that's great.
Jung was
I never
very
heard that before.
anti-systematic in the way he actually approached doing clinical work. He presents his theory in this very systematic sort of way, oftentimes, but it's more his followers that have systematized Jung more than anything else. And for Jung, each therapy was different because the person was different. He said there's no real Jungian psychotherapy because with each patient, there's a different therapy. And the way he described psychotherapy, he said it's like when two chemicals come together. When two chemicals come together, they both leave different. They both leave changed. And so when I think about therapy or when I do supervision, that involves, in order for that to happen, you have to be a presence in the room in order to affect the client, but you also have to be open enough to be affected by them to do good therapeutic work. And so it's this encounter between two authentic individuals where transformation happens. So similar to what you and I are doing now, we don't have an agenda, we don't have a script. We're just meeting each other in this space, and we're seeing what happens as a result of this encounter.
Yeah, absolutely. Hmm. I did, I did my the second time I was lucky enough to be able to do a year of therapy, and I do say lucky because it is a intense privilege, honestly. And I mean, for people who think they can't afford it, you should go out and find the free access to it because that stuff is out there. But if you
It
do
is
just yeah, as long as you, again, as long as you're jiving with the therapist and it's the right person for you, it's just a amazing experience. But one of them let me go on like 6 months longer after I couldn't pay anymore, just because he was so fat. He was so interested. He was interested in me. What can I say? He got a lot out of my insights into the issues I was having.
I'm
He found
sure.
insights in them that he hadn't found, and he was a 66-year-old founder of his organization. So he was, and that was, you're so right. I never thought about this before, but to see that my experiences and my reflections could impact his understanding of things even. I never thought about that as being a powerful part of the process, but it makes so much sense now that you say it, that it is.
Absolutely. And what you're alluding to is a key component of therapeutic change. And so, one of the things that happens that can be very transformative for clients is when they feel seen by their therapist, right? And so, oftentimes, what that will mean is that they see that they've impacted the therapist in some way. They've moved the therapist, and they know that because sometimes a therapist could tear up. A therapist could cry in response to what a patient shares, or like with your experience, the therapist shared the impact that you have had on him, right? And so that can be very compelling. And that for me is an important part of therapeutic change. Oh, I had this encounter with this person and they were genuinely moved by me. They saw me, and through seeing me, I was able to see myself reflected back to me in a way that I have never seen before. So it gives you an awareness of an otherness that now becomes infused with a certain amount of subjectivity, which is important because that's a way of making the unconscious conscious or shining light on the shadow.
Hmm. Yeah. So yeah. Yeah, it's profound. I hope people who have who are curious about therapy pursue it because it's not so stigmatized anymore. In fact, it's almost glorified. So it's like, hey, well, it's trendy. Maybe you should actually go find out if it's got
Sure.
some puissance to for you. Um, let me see what else I have here on if I have anything worthy of this. Going to pieces without falling apart. Going to pieces without falling apart. That is apropos of this whole process in therapy, like having a safe space for people to deconstruct themselves and open their
Absolutely.
base components up to new meaning through analysis, literally.
That's right.
It's hard not to see that, of course, in alchemical terms or alchemy. Have you heard the word alchemy?
I have not.
Oh, one of the fellows that John Dee was big into created this word to describe sort of spiritual alchemy. He called it alchemy in one of his texts, and Dr. Terry Burns is doing a great series of videos on all of that stuff. So I predict alchemy might be the word of 2024, since it liberates alchemy, spiritual alchemy, from the burden of physical alchemy and chemistry and all of that wonderful, never-ending, joyous debate. Uh,
Well, you're doing your part by introducing it here.
oh well, that that that's good. Yeah, you're. I, I wasn't thinking of that. All right, so one of the things I love, of course, the most about your book is how you approach the hermeneutics of it through his druidry, right? You look at his metaphysics through his druidry, and the concluding comparisons and the way you retell the Einigan the giant story, it was just such. I couldn't even go on reading that night. When I read it, I was just like, oh, this is, yeah, I can't do anything else tonight except go to sleep after reading that, because it's
Thank
such a
you.
great story. I saw a lot of the Dagda in it from Irish myth as well. I felt a lot of that same, the ever flowing, overflowing cauldron is very similar to the benevolent outgiving of Einigan, the giant,
Yes.
who is a being of tremendous compassion, but also, I don't know if this is the right word, but despair. I get a sense of a kind of built-in despair to the nature of its existence, which is very hard not to relate to as a mortal human being.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you're spot on as far as that. And as far as the book as a whole was concerned, that was one of my most enjoyable parts to write. And so that was a section that was included after obviously the dissertation was written. So the book that you have in your hands is what I wanted to write. That book right there, I drew it in Psychologist Clothing. But when I wrote the dissertation, there was a lot that I had to cut out. And so that section that you're talking about was a section that I included. And for me, that section I drew from Awen itself to write that. And so I try to write these more poetic types of sections from the place of inspiration. And so I don't think too much about it. I will only write when I feel moved to write, when I'm in that particular space. And to be honest, it's not me who writes it, it's something else that flows and writes through me. And so I can only take partial credit for what I wrote in that section.
Amen. Glory be to the giants of us all.
To the giants of
The
us
the
all.
the playfulness, of course, of taking the English transliteration of Hebrew N or Ain, the spelling of which is often
Yeah,
EIN. It's not the best spelling of it. It's probably better to be like EN, but EIN. And it lines up so well with Einigan the giant, and to
that's
turn
right.
that into a wordplay with the Ein mind, which
That's
of course
right.
also has the Ein, which means one in German. So the Ein Sof or mind, the Einigan the giant, the one giant,
Huh?
and the, because Einigan is like Germanic almost in origin, right? Like Einzigen means just one. There's only one of
Yes.
this thing. Um,
Yes.
there
Yeah.
was a oneness. There's an overflowing oneness from which all things came.
Overflowing
It's
ones.
so built. It's such a, again. There's people. Anyone who hasn't read this, go out and get this book, and please do that. From Anathema Publishing. We'll
Anathema
put an image
Publishing.
here on the screen.
It was a delight to work with Anathema Publishing, and um, Gabriel and his colleagues over there brought that book to life truly in a way that I never thought was imaginable. From the construction of the book all the way to the illustrations. Um, when you ask an artist to illustrate a concept, you never know what you're going to get. But what I got back exceeded all of my expectations in terms of what those illustrations actually looked like. Now, there's that one, that's the hypercube, right?
Yeah, I'll just show some people a couple images what for
Yeah,
those who will catch the video on my Patreon and whatnot. The art you had done by this fellow, the Black Monk, was
Black Phillip. Yeah.
Black Phillip, or sorry, not the Black Monk. Okay, yeah. Um,
Mhm.
quite a treat indeed. And it's nice to see another style in there, since of course, we have things like Sabagal and Uccello, who are such famous designers and artists. It's nice to have more coming into the mix and bringing in different elements uh with them into the world of fine occult publishing, which this is. And if you
Indeed.
think this book is beautiful, you should see the artisanal edition, which is unspeakably gorgeous. I may
It
have sold a
is.
kidney for it. Good
It's
operations
worth
dot com. Yeah.
sacrificing your kidney.
Wonderful. Outstanding. Well, this has been such a treat. All right, so like Kierkegaard, Buber, and Krishnamurti, and Alan Watts. And Alan Watts and Krishnamurti were students or disciples of Howe, which made me actually think, like, Howe may have been erased from our culture and even psychology to such an unfortunate extent until your championing of him and as his apologist. And this book coming out just now, which I think Denny on Foolish Fish wasn't understating it when he said this is a big deal. It just might take a while for people to realize it. Um,
Yeah, I
and
agree. I mean,
I hope you do put. I mean, obviously, I think most of us think you should just put out all of his works somehow.
well, that was part of the discussion with actually Anathema Publishing. There was some interest in that. And so we're still exploring that as a possibility, to maybe bring some of Howe's books back into print. We have to find out, obviously, who owns the copyright and maybe talk with that individual because you're right, though. Like, it's a shame that more people don't know about Eric Graham Howe. It's a shame that his books are not in print anymore, especially the book Cure or Heal. Like, War Dance was great, but Cure or Heal, for me, if we were to publish or reprint one book of Eric Graham Howe's, that would be the one. That would be the one that I think really distills his psychology in a nutshell. And if people were to read one book, read Cure or Heal. But you can't get it. That's the problem. Like, you can get it, but it's going to be super expensive if you buy it out of print on the used book market.
Yeah, when your book first arrived, there was one copy of Mind to the Druid for sale on Abe Books, and it was 150 bucks. I didn't get it. Someone got it because I know someone else received their copy of that, read that, and grabbed it, and God bless them. You can still get copies of it, of course, and it's not absurdly expensive, which is relative these days, but it's shocking that it's not being just republished, given how everything's being published. Given everything that's what isn't being published today. Is he the only thing not being published?
Right. In many ways, like he would almost prefer that would be the case. Right? So there's a way in which, yeah, like he's authored these brilliant books, countless articles. He's influenced Alan Watts, Krishnamurti, Henry Miller wrote about him. Like, all of these people, have had some kind of meaningful encounter with him, have been directly influenced by him. He's been influenced by them because it wasn't just one-sided. It was like Howe was
Oh yeah.
also influenced by these individuals as well, especially like Krishnamurti, right?
Hard to
He was
imagine being in a room with Alan Watts and Krishnamurti and being totally blasé.
yeah, like, I'm the teacher, you're the student. I'm closed off to anything that you have to say. Yeah, no, not at all. But in many ways, like, his legacy is through his patients, right? And obviously at this point, many of those patients may not be living anymore, but there's a way in which a therapist, like he says, you burn your own boat for the sake of your passengers, right? And so there's importance for him in some ways of remaining obscure, remaining concealed, remaining hidden, so that the focus is more on the impact of the work itself. And as a therapist, I know, like, your patients are your living legacy in some ways. And many therapists will say, you know what, like, I'm never really going to know how my client turned out post termination. And that's one of the frustrating things. You won't really know. You were a part of that phase of their journey, that phase of life for them. But the idea is that through your encounter, that client is taking a little bit of you with them, right? So like when Jesus says, you know, I have to die so that the Holy Spirit can be with you, I think there's truth in relation to psychotherapy. Termination is about the patient internalizing the therapist and taking the therapist with them, and also vice versa. So with any patient that I've ever worked with, any supervisee that I've ever worked with, I take them with me. I hold them in my own soul, and they hold me in their soul, and we take one another with each other on our respective journeys. And so for me, when I read Howe, that's enough for him. That's enough. He doesn't need anything more. If I'm playing my part in bringing his work to light, it's only to point to that one thing, not to elevate his name, and God forbid, create a system out of Howe's work, right? Wouldn't that be horrible? Like if someone became a Howean therapist, right?
Yeah.
No, doesn't exist.
But then we could have a Howing society, and
You
everyone
could.
who practices How would have to register. And
You
if they
would.
said something
Yes.
wrong, we would take away their credentials.
Right,
So we do have.
exactly.
I mean, this is Canada where I am, so we're all about that. You
Yeah.
know, yeah, we love
Yeah,
taking away
training institute where one
credentials.
can get certified as a Howean analyst.
So he'd roll over in his grave if all of that happened. He'd probably
For
rather
sure.
be on the fringes of the society for no explicable reason other than he might have stepped on the toes of the Freudians and systematic psychoanalysts.
Yeah,
Um,
and there and
you-
that was sort of like, you know, how being very anti-systematic was, you know, I look at Krishnamurti and his talks and the way he approached things as being very anti-systematic. So I do think in some way there was a mutual influence that was definitely there, even though people turn Krishnamurti into this icon and have a whole society and a foundation after him and all of that. But there's nothing like that in his work that would even suggest that something like that is appropriate.
as an anthroposophist and Waldorf school alumni for 13 years, we did the same thing with Steiner, right? The same
Yeah, right.
exact thing. Like he left no will because his core belief was spiritual freedom. That's the core. That's why they don't teach you anthroposophy in Waldorf school at all. It's all about spiritual freedom for Steiner. And so he left no will because that would have gone against it. So what happened right after? They're like, okay, he was the one initiate. There's no more. We'll get rid of Valentin Tomberg and anyone else who was anywhere close to his status in the society and just turn him into a saint. And we're in charge here in Dornoch at the executive board. Like it was crazy to grow up and realize sort of what had happened to Steiner's legacy after him. Although it wasn't a complete disaster, otherwise we wouldn't have the biggest private school system in the world. And I'm very
Right.
grateful for
That's
having had
true.
that experience as much as it was different, shall we say.
Mhm.
It was different.
Amen.
Um, yeah. I've got a couple more quotes from your book on how that I would really love to just hit. Um, and yeah, so here it is. You say the discursive or thinking mind can then be free to either emphasize the differences between psychological cycles, binary thinking, or the points of intersection, ternary thinking. Binary thinking is needed when opposition to a given psychological cycle is in order, when it is necessary to stop and redirect a particular energy or rhythm, when balance is attained through pairing one emotion, affect, or thought with its opposite. Ternary thinking is needed when flowing with a given psychological current is necessary, as is the case when grieving, for instance, deepens the soul and allows the person to mourn the loss for the sake of moving through it so that the self and the world are transmuted, integrating the loss as the end of a certain possibility for being and the initiation of another as an unknown future that unfolds through the loss.
Did I say all of that?
That's a long sentence, but I
That's a
really
real
loved
run
it.
on. That's like a German sentence.
Es war doch wunderbar, mein Freund.
It's a
Doch
whole
wunderbar.
paragraph.
I loved it. Umberto Eco would have said it's far too short.
Okay. Well, good, because some have said it's far too long.
No,
But
I'm a fan. I'm a fan of long
okay.
sentences. I really do want to bring out more of this idea of ternary thinking and leading into the idea and understanding of the sort of the druidic and spiritual core of Howe's thought. So the metaphysic with the anti-systematic system and methodology. And
Yeah, and of course, you know that Howe approached Druidry in a very anti-systematic way, because he simply said, Druids are the masters of the art of living, really nothing more, nothing less. That's what they are. And so they go about it in certain ways, but that's what it was about. Um, so when we look at this kind of notion of binary thinking, ternary thinking, in many ways they go together, right? They're not necessarily forms of thought that are separate, but they're called upon at different times and for different purposes, right? And so when you think about the binary thinking, like oftentimes people say like, okay, we want to do away with binaries. We want to do away with duality, right? We want to transcend and transgress all of that. But for Howe, and I think for Druidry, there is this emphasis on the importance of binaries, of opposites, and what happens in some way when you have an extreme position that requires the integration of its opposite. So anytime there's an extreme position that one is taking, one pairs that with its opposite. And the idea is that it brings it back to the middle to restore some sense of balance. That can be through discursive practice, through language, through words. Ternary thinking is in some ways A, B, and then C, right? So you have the thesis, you have the antithesis, and then you have the synthesis, right? So there's something very dialectical about that. And so one of the ways that that can kind of take expression is to move with and flow with something, like this experience of mourning, of depression, of melancholy, of loss, kind of to move with that and not to resist it in some way, to flow with the experience itself, and to simply see and trust that the experience is going to lead somewhere, and that somewhere is ultimately important. But it's the idea, like in Howe talks about, there's the I, the me, and there's the child, right? And the two come together to produce the third in some way. And so again, in Druidry, we always have the emphasis of threes, right? The triadic structure, like threes are everywhere in Druidry. And here Howe is with his psychology, putting out another tertiary kind of structure to things, I, me, I, other, child, right? These threes that come up. And so this is a cheeky little subtle way, I think, of how revealing his Druidry, in this Druidic structure of the way of taking up psychological life, which I think is vitally important.
yes, I really enjoyed that whole side to how actually, had little traces of Yeats. Somewhere out there in the world, there could be one day a very odd thesis looking at how compared to Yeats's A Vision.
That would
Honestly,
be
it,
wonderful.
it would
If
be a
this
weird.
inspires that, wonderful.
It's
You
something
just
I
threw
would
that
love to.
out there.
I would love to read it.
Maybe you should write it.
I don't think so. I don't. I think
No?
I have enough other Yates. I'm following enough Yates trains of as a tongue tied. Look at me. Okay. Yeah, I've got I think I've got enough on my plate, like honestly, for the next 20 years. You know what I
Very
mean?
well.
That's like, yeah, there's so much I want to do and so much I'm working on. It's like, okay, well, this will take 5 more years. This will take 7. This will take 10. It's like, wow, we need more lifetimes. to
I'm with you on that. Yeah, there's so many ideas that I want to develop and books that I want to write. And yeah, I don't think I'll have enough time to do it. So it might just be like, all right, I'm going to sink my teeth into something like that might be like a magnum opus or something. You never know. And so I
yeah.
have some things kind of I'm throwing around in relation to actually Jung's Red Book that I
Oh,
want to do at some point in the future.
I do need to come clean. I never really read much Freud and Jung directly. I'm probably one of the few esotericists or occultists that hasn't really got the Red Book on his shelf. But it's simply that it came out late, just like a lot of the Lacanian seminars. Like I had to write my book, my thesis on Lacan, or sorry, on well, not on Lacan. I was writing it and I was using a Badiou, but it was the same year that Badiou came out, that Being an Event came out in English. So I had to use Badiou before Being an Event was in English because
Hmm.
I was writing that year. So then, of course, I didn't know it was coming out because, how would you know? We didn't have the social media really back then in 2004 or five. And then it came out and it was like, oh my God, look at this. And then the seminars started coming, the écrits
Right.
that your supervisor worked on. So those weren't even available in English for me. And I fortunately wasn't required to read them in French because it was a master's, not a PhD, right? So I was allowed to ignore them for this, which was fortunate. But yeah, the where was I? The Badiou, yeah, his full theory was just it was I sort of lost my train of thought, but it was incomplete. I had to work with very limited resources back in those days, and a lot of the texts that I really wanted to work with just weren't available. So I wasn't really able to even attempt to write any kind of opus or really explore all the thoughts I want to. But now those things are translated, so I'm digging back into all of it. And it's very exciting. It's very exciting,
Oh,
especially
it is.
my French was never that good. I'm more of a Germanist.
I love Lacan seminars, especially seminar 20 on feminine jouissance, right? So that's sort of my favorite Lacan seminar, the very last one, the encore, where he actually talks about feminine jouissance.
Yeah, I will make a note. Seminar 20.
Mhm. Yeah, I refer to that. So if you read
You do.
volume 2 of Being and Non-Being, it's all there. And I continue the discussion of Lacan in volume 3 in my commentary to Vulture's Cry. So when I compose sort of the commentary to Kenneth Grant, there are commentaries to my commentary, which are all in the form of footnotes. And so I pattern it off of like Crowley's like The Vision and the Voice, where you have like these extensive footnotes that serve as a commentary to the text. So I structured it in a very similar way, so that you read the text, you read the commentary, and then you also look at the footnotes. And so Badiou, Deleuze, Foucault, all of these people are kind of referred in that.
Yeah. Um, Sorry, my mind just whirling with wonderful thoughts on these fellows. Um, can we touch on inferiority complex?
If you want, how much more? So because I have to depart
Yeah,
in
that's
a
why I was
little bit.
thinking if I dump more into Lacan and Foucault, this will go on
Yeah,
forever. And
because
I have this one quote I would love
sure,
to
let's
ask you
do that.
about before we say farewell. So
Yeah,
awesome, awesome. This has been so much fun. And when I do get a copy of your spare book, I'll let you know after I've read it, and we can
please
maybe
do.
chat again. But I look forward to reading
Absolutely.
the Chumbly and the Kenneth Grant as well. And just due to the nature of your work, I'll probably have to read the Crowley one as well, though it's Crowley is always last on my list. So Eric Graham, so the inferiority complex stuff as it leads into everything in Howe's psychology was one of my favorite parts of the book, surprisingly, honestly, I guess because I just didn't really ever think about it that much. And Eric Graham Howe said The commonly advocated way of cure for an inferiority complex is as negative and futile as the disease itself. It is particularly popular in America, where hope still thrives, undismayed along with every kind of religious cult that offers the promised land now. There is no problem and there is no pain. Only believe and you shall receive. Knock and enter, all is yours.
Don't you love that?
I had to quote Howe verbatim at least once on this podcast so people could get a sense of what a eminent writer he is. He's present, he's clear, concise, he's a delight to read. You can read a collection of his stuff there, and definitely in this book. He also saw the idea of affirmations, like, this common idea of affirmations in the mirror, gosh darn it, people like me, that's so old Saturday Night
Yeah, the
Live.
Stuart Smiley
Yeah,
or
Stuart Smiley, right? But Howe
yeah.
actually thought that affirmations were not an effective approach, and in contradiction to Jung and Freud, I believe, or maybe it was Lang. So I would love to end with a bit of
Yep.
your thoughts on that, just so
No,
people
for
can,
sure.
because the world, people are having a hard time, man. People are having a hard time, and everyone appreciates your people like you coming on podcasts like mine to share what you can share. And so thank you again before yeah,
Yeah, not a problem. I enjoyed this thoroughly, by the way. And
thank you.
anytime you would want me back, I'm interested in dialoguing with you. No, but that's so that idea, like looking at the inferiority complex, and let's just apply that to affirmations, right? Because that's big time right now. People are doing all kinds of like positive affirmation work. Um, so if we go back to what we said earlier in reference to Howe's understanding of depression, right? And so what we're looking at in terms of treating depression is similar in terms of what we're looking at in terms of treating the inferiority complex. So when someone is looking in the mirror and they're speaking positive affirmations to their reflection, right? Are they, do they have a right relationship to reality? Right? That would be the question that you would ask. Now, what they're doing is they're trying to convince themselves ultimately that what they're feeling isn't ultimately true. So it's a compensatory function. So anytime, whether you look at Adler was the first really to talk about the inferiority complex, right? And so a positive affirmation from the perspective of Howe's work is problematic simply because it's compensatory. And so what one is saying, one doesn't really believe and one doesn't really feel. One's just trying to convince themselves that they feel and they believe a certain way. So what Howe would say is, let's cut away all of that bullshit. Let's remove positive affirmations and let's explore what's really there. Let's practice acceptance, right? Because that was a key practice for him, practicing acceptance. And even like what's talked about now as radical acceptance, that's something that is popular in the psychological literature now, like Tara Brach, the Buddhist-oriented psychotherapist who is a big proponent of mindfulness, talks about radical acceptance. So the idea from Howe's point of view is to accept what is actually the case and what is actually true. So it's to peel back the layer of this positive affirmation, which is a proclamation of superiority in many ways. And someone's trying to convince themselves that there's something that they're not. And to like explore what is really there, which could actually be feelings of inferiority, a feeling of smallness, a feeling of depression, a feeling of despair, right? All of those things that at some point need to be dealt with and actually integrated. It's like putting perfume on shit, right? It's still shit, it just smells better.
I was thinking of makeup over acne rather than changing your diet, Yeah.
Yeah,
But
something like that,
but yours throws us back to Martin Luther, and we always want to go back to Martin Luther if we can, right?
for sure.
So yeah, you're putting a band-aid over the wound without treating it, essentially,
Yes.
with
And the
affirmation.
idea is to treat the wound, to go to the source, to go to the core issues. And not only to cognize them and to intellectually understand them, but the importance is to feel them. That's the thing with psychotherapy. You're invited not just to make note of, but to feel what you make note of, right? And so whatever is there that the affirmation is trying to distract you from, you ultimately want to note and feel. That's the only way wholeness can occur. And that's hard for the vast majority of people because they would rather, in many ways, find shortcuts. And that's why I think Howe was so critical of using substances, because he felt that it took people away from that deeper level work. So like when Melanie Klein, when you look at her object relations approach, you move from a paranoid to a depressive position, which involves withdrawing one's projections in some way. And so like acknowledging in some way the fundamental truth about oneself, and that can lead to depression. That could lead to a state of sadness, of melancholy. But as for Howe, as for so many other depth psychologists, that was a process that one works through, and it wasn't an end stage. It's something that you had to give time to work itself out in a safe place, a safe environment, ultimately for wholeness to be experienced.
So if you're in denial about being a jerk, you need to find out why you're a jerk first before you can stop being a jerk.
Yeah, because the origin story for a jerk or a bully can be quite compelling in terms of where that comes from, in their own life history.
As proven by Steve Martin. Blessed be he.
Right. And so many others that have origin stories that, without reflecting on and understanding, can only lead to partial healing.
Amen. A last thought. Given how little we actually know about Druidry and the history and the Druids, right? Now we've all read Hutton now or have it on our shelves, and at least absorb it through osmosis, right, kids? And so we know there isn't like even the sickles, even the golden sickles. They took our Getafix's magical weapon away from us out of the history. I hope that they did use sickles, but in all the reconstructionism that so much of us love, and I love the work of John Michael Greer. I love the various Druid orders out there, from Boda to Arnriachtaine, or not Boda, but Obod to Arnriachtaine, and the other ones. I think it's great that they exist and they're out there, but it does seem that given how little we know about the Druids, and given what little we do know, that in the anti-systematic approach that Eric Graham Howe took, he in some ways encapsulated perhaps a more authentic version of the true minimalism representative of history of what Druidry,
Yes.
of all that Druidry can really truly be at core to us today.
Yes, that is spot on. I think that's exactly what he was really trying to do, which would be to capture or describe the Druidic spirit, the Druidic soul. And so if you think about, I can't remember the biblical, I know I can paraphrase the biblical passage. It's the letter killeth, and it's the spirit that gives life. And so I can't remember where that's from, but I know that's a biblical verse.
Yeah. It's the
And
letter
so
of the spirit of the law. Yeah.
And so I think the idea for him when taking up Druidry or any of the spiritual traditions would be to connect with its very spirit, with its very soul, and to kind of strip away all of its clothing, so to speak, right? We're talking about a Druid and psychologist clothing, but in many ways, like, what is the soul of Druidry? And for him, they were masters of the art of living, and it was because they were connected deeply with the soul of nature, but also connected with Awen as the source. And they were drawing their inspiration from Awen. And I describe in the book on Howe that it's not somethingness or nothingness, but that which translates nothingness into somethingness. And so it's this bridge where the invisible becomes visible. And that can come in the form of song, of poetry, of spiritual practice, love, ecstasy, joy, a deep feeling of connection, all of these things. And then what happens when one has such an encounter and then attempts to speak that into existence? And I think Howe's psychology was a Druidic psychology. I really believe that. He doesn't call it that, but it certainly was in the very spirit of what Druidry is. And I would say what he was doing with his patients was trying to help them to connect with Awen. I really do. I think there's a way in which he was pointing to that in their lives, in their experiences, and saying, look, I'm not the source. I'm not the healer. I'm here to direct you to that source. Whatever the fuck you want to call it, it doesn't matter. But there is that source that I'm inviting you to connect with.
Dr. Ian C. Edwards, thank you so much for being with me here today. I think
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
I can't imagine a better note to end on. I mean, maybe other than that. So it actually brings to mind, of course, the where two or more present,
That's right. There I am also.
right? So where two are present, hopefully all the spirits and spirit and listeners have also been here and will be as I release this. And thank you so much. We'll talk again. I'd love to read your
Absolutely.
I will be buying your spare book when I have a second and reading that. And probably then I'll have reread your work here as well again because I get a lot out of it. Like both
Appreciate that.
psychology. It's I was always more into Reich than Freud and Jung. I didn't get to really say much of that, but through my readings on Robert Corrington, and now that I've discovered how, I sort of was a bit upset with some of the nights reading and wishing I had found him younger and could have really taken psychology more seriously at university, but I bailed out of philosophy and went into theology because I was so despondent with the way that professors were treating me from the get-go in college after Waldorf. And thank God I did. Thank God I found theology because there was some pretty scary profs at college, of the you're all insane type, you're just mentally
Yeah.
ill. Yeah, there's
Yeah. Yeah. And I think what I'm thinking of now in relation to that, in relation to your story and so many others where they say, I wish something could have been different than the way it was. I think like what Nietzsche talked about in relation to the eternal return, almost as a thought experiment, to kind of acknowledge that and then to ask myself, if I could do everything all over again in exactly the same way, would I do it? Of course, the answer is yes. Love of fate, amor fati, right? And so for me, and with anyone that has gone through challenging or difficult times or even trauma, and they've come to a place of healing or acceptance, everything that happened to you is a part of who you are today, and it's formed you. And the idea is to look at that without any regrets, without any resentment, and say yes to it.
yes, 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 yes.
Yes, yes,
I
yes.
love it. I love it. I love your work. Love
Thank
to
you.
you and to your family this beautiful Yuletide. Have a wonderful holidays, my friend, and happy New Year.
To you and yours as well.
All right. Let
All
me
right.
stop that recording and then let you go.